Hello everyone, it's 2 o'clock, so we will get started. Welcome to this webinar with Kevin Milligan and Tammy Schirle, who will discuss core capacity to work at older ages. My name is Sarah Fortin, I'm the Knowledge Transfer Coordinator for the CRDCN. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to present the network, for those of you who may not be familiar with us yet. So the Canadian Research Data Center Network with CRDCN is a partnership between Canadian universities and Statistics Canada, supported by SHIRC, CIHR, and the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, CFI. Thank you for the move. And as you can see on the slide here, the map, it's truly a pan-Canadian network comprising now 29 research data centers located across the country. Actually, one of these RDC is opening this very day at Nipissing University. RDCs are secure computer labs and generally located on a university campus. They allow researchers with an approved project to use a microdata files collected by Statistics Canada, I mean by that the master files, including from census, longitudinal surveys, and an increasing number of administrative data sets. Last year, more than 1,500 researchers from various disciplines have accessed an RDC, and about a third of them were graduate students. The research carried through the network is very diverse and have helped better understand social and economic developments affecting the whole society, but also factors affecting individual life course and well-being. This includes, among other things, population aging, integration of immigrants, socio-economic determinants of health, income inequality, child development, and so on. To know more about us, I invite you to visit our website at crdcn.org, where, among other things, you can search the online bibliography to find the most recent publication by our researcher in your area of interest, or browse the data search engine to see what data sets are available if you wish to do some research with us. Next slide, please. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today. Kevin Milligan is Professor of Economics at the University of British Columbia and also the Academic Director of the BCI, the British Columbia Inter-University Research Data Center. His research spans the fields of public and labor economics, including taxation, with a focus on economics of children and the elderly. He's published extensively on these topics over the last several years in many scientific journals. And Tammy Schirle is also Professor of Economics, but at Wilfrid Laurier University, and she's the Director of the Laurier Center for Economic Research and Policy Analysis. Her research interests include the economics of elderly, income inequality, social policy, and the economics of gender. She's also published very extensively on these topics in the very best journals. Next slide, please. Now, just before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. Kevin will do the presentation. He will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A period where both Tammy and Kevin will answer your question. Note that our microphones will be automatically muted during the presentation. As you can see on the slide here, to ask a question, we invite you to write it down by clicking the question tab on your screen, and when the Q&A period starts, I will read it for you. All right, next slide, please. Just wanted to mention that the slides and the video will be available after the webinar on our website and on our YouTube channel. So that's it for me. Thank you, Tammy and Kevin, for being with us today. I appreciate it very much, and for you to take the time to share your research result with us. And the mic is now over to you, Kevin.
Merci, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction and for the words about the CRDCN. What I'll be presenting today is joint work with Tammy Schirle from Wilfrid Laurier University. I'm Kevin Milligan from the University of British Columbia at Vancouver School of Economics. Our topic is the work capacity and health of older Canadians. So here is different pictures of the two of us. I have more hair there. but same two people. Okay, just as a motivating starting place, this graph shows life expectancy from birth here in this graph, taken cross-sectionally at different ages. This is the standard life expectancy measure, and graphed out for females and for males. And over the course of the 20th century, there were great advances for both females and for males. We've noted on here some interesting aspects of Canada's retirement income system. Let me start in the middle of it there. You see old age security was introduced in 1951 federally. You had to be 70 years old to receive old age security pension at that point. That wasn't reduced to 65 until the 1960s. So that started in, coincidental with the introduction of the GIS and the CPP in the 1960s. Then in 1975, the allowance was brought in for those married to an old age security recipient who were age 60 could receive it. And then in 1987, not on this graph, but we all know it, 1987 under the Canada Pension Plan, in 1984 under the Quebec through the 20th century of pension entitlement ages getting lower and lower at the same time as life expectancy going higher and higher. This is true in Canada, also true in other old age, other OECD countries. And you can see the tension there. That is, for living longer and longer and working shorter and shorter, that means the time period in retirement is growing through time. And that becomes more and more challenging to figure out how to fund that, whether it's by individual saving, whether it's by a pay-as-you-go pension system, and whether that's by a funded pension system like the CPP and the QPP. Through any of those methods, as lifespans get longer and working ages get smaller, the time period that must be funded is going to increase, and that's going to create some stress for the system. So that's some motivation. Recent policy developments, in 2012, the previous government announced a future extension of the retirement eligibility age for old age security and guaranteed income supplement to age 67 from age 65. It wasn't going to be phased in until the 2020s. In 2016, that was reversed. So a planned future expansion of the entitlement age didn't happen. It was reversed. This is contrary to the trend in almost every other OECD country, where the main pension entitlement ages have been extended. In some countries, they are now indexed explicitly to life expectancy. In some countries, this change has been dramatic. In Italy, for example, just a couple years ago, they bumped up the age of entitlement to their public pensions by 2 to 3 years, and that happened overnight. There was no phase-in period. They just kind of announced it. So in Italy specifically, there's been a drastic change in the ages of eligibility over the past decade. But that is something you see across the OECD. Canada has chosen a different path, and that's fine. Governments can choose different paths. What we're going to do in this paper is to think about what are some of the consequences of that choice and this environment of work at older ages and the future of it for Canada. Okay, so the main, what we see is improvements in life expectancy, and we'll argue here that this is an improvement in healthy life expectancy. And the main question we ask in the paper is there a capability to work longer? So what we do is describe the capacity to work among older individuals in an empirical way. We do that through two main methods. One is to look at mortality risk as a proxy for health capacity. And then that's a very coarse measure of health capacity to work, but it has some advantages, as we'll discuss in a few minutes. But then we're going to look at a much more richer and subtle measures of health capacity to work, and using some microdata at the RDC to look at employment capacity of older workers. A brief preview of our findings is we find that if people today work the same as they did in 1976, conditional on mortality risk, then men today would work 5 more years in between the ages of 55 and 69, and women would work 2 more years in between the ages of 55 to 69. We think this is a fairly big number. I mean, there's only 15 years in there, and we're saying you could work potentially 5 more of those years than you are now. If you work the same now as men did in 1976, conditional on mortality risk. Employment rate of men could potentially be 29 points higher than it was than what we observed if people worked the same at age 64 as they did at earlier ages based on their health characteristics. We'll get into the details of those calculations to come, but that gives you a sense of the flavor here, which is to say that our findings are that we think there is a substantial health capacity to work among today's older workers, or older citizens, some of whom are workers and some aren't. Okay, so the data for our analysis is going to come from a number of sources. The first one is the labor force survey. This is, from this, we're going to draw age and sex-specific employment rates. For women, we're going to take a subsample of people who worked since age 45. This is important because for females, especially as we look back through time, there's a share of females, a much larger share of females who never enter the workforce. So in order to make, to have retirement be a meaningful concept, we select a subsample of women who have some indication of life cycle attachment to the workforce. And the way we do that is we say you have to have worked at least 1 year since age 45. If you have, then we're going to tag you as being someone who has worked and look at your employment at older ages. Beyond a 1-0 employed, not employed measure, we also look at usual hours worked for a more continuous measure of labor supply. Second thing we do is we look at the Canadian Human Mortality Database, and we draw out mortality statistics based on that. We also actually extend that by 1 year to 2012. That's only available to 2011. We construct our own for 2012, and we back check our construction versus the skilled demographers who put together the Canadian Human Mortality Database, and we find that our measure is extraordinarily close to theirs. We followed their methodology as best possible, and we think we were able to do so quite well. And finally, this is where the RDC data come in. We look at the Canadian Community Health Survey, 2001-2014 RDC files, and try to predict employment as a function of observed health conditions and health characteristics. To start, some background trends of what's going on in the data. We see employment rates here for males and for females. This is based on the labor force survey for ranges 60 to 64 and 65 to 69. What we see looking at the top here, I'll wave an arrow here. I think you can all see that. This is males at 60 to 64. What we saw from 1976, the first year we have this data, until 1995 is a fairly large decline of 20 or 25 percentage points in the employment rate. And then an upswing from 1995 where we've almost recovered back to where we were. I mean, we recovered back to where we were in about 1980 for males aged 60 to 64, so a U-shaped pattern. In a related international comparison project that Tammy and I are involved in, we can say that for 12 OECD countries that are participating in the project, this U-shaped trend is common to, I think, all of them. The depth of that U, how low it goes and how far it swings back up, varies quite a bit across countries, but the U-shaped pattern with a dip somewhere in the mid-90s is very common across all of them, which is interesting. Sticking with the males for a moment, we see age 65 to 69. There's a bit of a drop, but not much to see, but really an upswing since the early 2000s, and it's quite a big one, about a doubling of the employment rates of older males. For females, it's a bit more complicated to study, and the reason is that females in the cohorts that were arriving at these older ages over this time period had vastly different life cycle work behavior. So if you look at 1980, the women who were hitting age 60 in 1980 were born in 1920. A very small share of them worked outside the home because, you know, if you're born in 1920, you were 30 in 1950. There were an awful lot of stay-at-home mothers in that case in the 1950s. Where you saw the emergence of female labor force participation in Canada, the decade where that really emerged was the 1970s. So if you were, you know, age 40 in 1975, it means you're born in 1935. Born in 1935, that makes you 60 in 1995. And perhaps not coincidentally, that's where we start to see the female employment rates take off. So when we look at the males, we see, you know, we can kind of separate out the year-specific effects from the cohort effects because there's not strong cohort effects in life cycle employment rates for men, whereas for women there are. So for women, there's kind of two things going on here, potentially that cohort effect, but also that potentially a year-based effect of what's going on post-1995. So we can't really disentangle these here, but it's very important to look at the women as well here, but just to understand that the story is perhaps a bit more complicated there. So that's the overall trends in employment rates. Next slide has a look at mortality rates. So these are period mortality rates, how many people died in a given year, given age, and a given sex. So we've graphed here males and females separately. Males are in, I'm going to call that turquoise, and females, I'm going to call that rust. So we have rust and turquoise. For the males in turquoise here, we can see 1976, 1994, and 2012, so kind of an early, a midpoint, and a late. And what we see is an absolutely vast drop in mortality rates for males. It's easiest to see, they're kind of most spread apart, say at age 70 here, where you can see, you know, about 2% of 70-year-olds males are dying in a given year in 2012, and that was about 4% in 1976. So mortality rates dropped by about half over this period. And you can see, you know, in 1994 compared to 2012, this has been fairly steady over that time period. There's been continual improvements through time. It wasn't all concentrated in the 70s or 80s or concentrated in the 90s and 2000s. It has been fairly steady through time for males, and it has been substantial. For females, now females started off with a mortality advantage that fewer females die at any given age. The gains have also been smaller. If you look at age 70, you can see it's about a bit over 2%, dropped to more like 1.5% by age 70. So the gains for females have been smaller, but they started off in a better position. So there has been some catch-up for males compared to females in terms of mortality rates. Now, if you look down here, the percentage gains are, you know, different at different ages, and we can talk more about that. But there has been gains across these older age ranges, and they've been more substantial for males than for females. But overall, they have been quite large. Interesting way to characterize this is to take life expectancy since age 65, so conditional on reaching age 65, how many more years do you live? If you do that calculation in 1965 and you do that calculation in 2012, on average, life expectancy has increased by 5 years post-age 65. Now, that's interesting. The reason why we chose 1965 for that characterization is in 1965, the old age security eligibility age was 70. So if you compare 1965 to now, what that means is we are living 5 more years, and the eligibility age has gone in the other direction by 5 years, which means comparing now to 1965, we're paying for, on average, 10 more years of old age security eligibility, which again, if you're looking at the fiscal impact of old age security in 1965 compared to the fiscal impact of old age security now, we're looking at paying for 10 more years of old age security than we were for the case in 1965. Next point of discussion is thinking of what's underlying these improvements in older age mortality. The literature on this suggests a couple of things. One is smoking cessation had a big impact on mortality changes over this time period, and treatment for heart health and for heart attack mortality has improved tremendously over this period. And perhaps, you know, those risks are a bit higher for males in both cases, and perhaps that's why male improvements have been better. What's interesting is people will note that smoking cessation, perhaps those gains have been exhausted. The cohort versus cohort smoking, lifetime smoking exposure for newly retiring cohorts is their exposure to smoking is much less than previous cohorts. So perhaps those gains have been exhausted. Looking forward to this, some have argued that obesity rates and obesity exposure over the life cycle has been increasing. And, that's possible. Some people have been arguing perhaps for a long time that those mortality trends are going to turn around maybe next year, maybe the year after, just around the corner. We've seen those predictions for a long time now, and that could be happening. I cannot predict the future. But what I can predict is that medical technology is continuing to improve, and that whatever obesity-related, deterioration in mortality rates may be coming are going to be at least potentially offset by improvements in medical technology. And so, we will, when we see that turnaround in mortality rates, we will call it, but we haven't seen it on the aggregate in any case, yes. Final important point that I'm sure is already in some of your heads is the differences across socioeconomic groups, whether that's by education, by income, is important for the study of mortality, and potentially in the 1980s, looking at the CPP administrative records up to the 1980s. They only had a couple of decades of data to look at there. And they did find some evidence of SES gradients in mortality. More recent work has looked at a matching of mortality data to the 1991 Canadian census and looked at SES gradients there, and again found some evidence of that. Work in the US has also looked at that, although we want to be cautious about interpreting SES gradients from the US to SES gradients in Canada, because there are many aspects of Canadian society that are quite different, whether it's health insurance, whether it's transfers to low income, that I'd be very cautious about taking evidence from the US and applying it to Canada. I would argue, and I think we would argue, Tammy and I both, that there's not enough evidence of SES gradients here in Canada to make strong statements about it, but it's certainly something you want to keep firmly in mind and at the front of your mind when you're making any potential policy recommendations about what should happen to our pension system based on changes in mortality, based on change in work capacity, because these SES gradients may be very important in those. So we want to be very cautious before making policy pronouncements until we have a much firmer grasp on what's happening at different parts of the income distribution and socioeconomic status. Audio connection restored. I don't know how much of that you lost. I'll assume I haven't been talking to myself. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to do now. What we're going to do is try to measure the health capacity to work of older workers, and do that in a couple of ways. So just to go back a couple slides for a second, we see this upswing in employment rates. What's driving that? Is it that people are feeling healthier and they're able to work more? Is it that people see that they're going to live longer and are choosing, like, my savings aren't going to last so long, therefore I want to work more? Is it changes in our pension system that are encouraging more work? Is it males who see their spouse continuing to work are now choosing to work more years? These are all things that come into play. What we're going to do in this paper is address one aspect of that, which is the health capacity to work, and to ask the question, is some of that increase in employment that we see, is that related to increases in health capacity? So we're going to start off this analysis by looking at mortality as an indicator of health. So in other words, we're saying if you're a male age 62 in Canada in 1991, what's your risk of dying? We're going to compare that to females in Canada in 2007 at age 67 and look at the risk of dying of that cell. Looking across these age, sex, year cells, look at the mortality risk and say that's going to be what we're going to use to characterize the health of people in those different cells. So if I see your mortality risk is greater, I'm going to say people in those cells are predicted to be in worse health. Now, clearly, this is a very coarse measure of health. Are you dead? Are you alive? Is pretty much as coarse as you can get. It's binary. It doesn't take into account any of the great subtleties that we as social scientists all know matter in measuring someone's health. So why would you ever do this? There are a few answers. Number one answer is it's easy to measure. It's binary. It's available for some countries for centuries. For Sweden, you have mortality data going back to the 1700s. In Canada, we have it back to 1921, but importantly, we have it back at least to the 1970s, where we can match that up with employment data from the 1970s. Now, later in this paper, we're going to turn to the Canadian Community Health Survey. We only have that from 2001. So if we wanted to look at decade by decade patterns and kind of look at what's going on in the 1970s versus now, we can't do that if we restrict ourselves to these really nice detailed health surveys that we have. And so if we want to take a longer, 50-year look at this data, we have to look at the data that we have over that 50-year period. And our position is that the best data we have over a longer time period is this mortality data. Secondly, this allows us to look across countries. It's internationally comparable. There's a lot of social science evidence that suggests when you look at those subtle health measures, whether it's self-assessed health, whether it's other kinds of health data that might be available, there can be differences across countries, not just what's available in surveys, but how people answer surveys. There's very strong differences in how people answer subjective questions across countries, even within the OECD, where they look at Southern Europe versus Northern Europe. The Danes, the people in Denmark, tend to answer very differently than people in Portugal, just because of cultural differences in how you answer questions, which means that when you try to make these international comparisons, you have to be very careful in how you do it when you look at survey data. If you have survey data, the answers from the surveys can be different. Our position here is that looking at mortality risk, if you're dead in Portugal, it means the same darn thing as if you're dead in Denmark. It means the same thing as if you're dead in Canada. So we can compare these things across time. We can compare them across countries. It's not subjective. Unless you're the parrot in the old Monty Python sketch, we kind of know that you're dead. That's why we're going to use it. We acknowledge that it's coarse, which is why we're going to go on in the second half of the paper to look at more subtle measures and see if we get different kinds of answers. So we're going to try to exploit this coarse measure for what we can get out of it, which is some international comparisons, some long time span comparisons, and then go to the subtle health measures that are much richer to do what we can with that. So we think of these methods as complementary. Okay, so employment-mortality relationship. What we're going to do here is essentially a graphical-based analysis where we're going to show a scatter plot of age-specific employment and mortality rates and look for changes across time. It's easiest to explain by looking at it on a graph. So what we have here on the x-axis, where the little hand is waving around, is the death rate. So this is the period death rate, taking a given age, year, and sex. So this point right here is 2012 for males, age 67. How many of them dying? It's about, eyeballing that, it looks like about 1.4% of males age 67 are dying in 2012. Plot that against the employment rate for males age 67 in 2012, and something like 25% of them were working. And that's how we get this data point right here. Plot that again for every point between age 55 and 69 for 2012 males, and that traces out this red curve right here. Okay, repeat the exercise for 1976. 1976, we repeat the exercise. We look at this death rate employment graph, and we plot it on the same axis is the key part here. So what the point of this exercise is, we take these age 67 males who had a death rate of 1.4%, and we ask ourselves, back in 1976, at what age were males facing a mortality risk of 1.4%? So we go, and the answer is about age 56 or so, 56, 57. Males in 1976 had the same death rate as males in 2012 at age 67. But males at that same, remember we're using this as a health proxy, at that same health level in 1976, something like 83% of them were working. So this gap here of 25 percentage points versus 83 percentage points, if you buy this as a proxy, this death rate as a proxy for health status, it says that males in 67 could work about 83 minus 25 quickly is about 58 percentage points. 58% more males could be working in 2012 if they worked the same as those 1976 males per unit of death rate as a proxy for health capacity. Okay, so that's this vertical distance right here that we're interested in. Now comes the magic trick, which is we do that same thing for every single age here, all the way across the age range from 55 to 69. If you're good at calculus, you know that what you can do then is just integrate between these curves. So you take the sum of the difference between these curves. Now, we're going to do it on a age by age basis, so it's not perfect calculus. It's going to be more like a Riemann sum than calculus here. But if you add up this vertical distance here and sum it across all these ages, you get the answer that the total gap between the blue line and the red line is about 5 years of work. To put that in a sentence, the following sentence could be said. If males in Canada in 2012, between the ages of 55 to 69, worked as much as their counterparts in 1976 per unit of mortality risk, they would work 5 more years than they currently do. So that's what we get out of this graph. Here's the same thing for females. Now the graph looks quite different. Recall that we're conditioning here on evidence that you have worked post age 45. We do that because we want to take out the women who through their life cycle had very little attachment to the labor force. We want to do that because the idea of retirement is a bit more difficult to grasp for those who were out of the workforce for most of their career. So the shape here looks different for women. What this says is 1976 compared to 2012, the sum of the difference between the blue line and the red line is only about 2 years. What does that mean? Is that potentially there's less extra health capacity to work for women than for men, or alternatively, what we've seen, if you go back a long way here, this is pretty clear when we look back here, from the 70s till now, let's look at age 60 to 64 here, the orange line, women are working an awful lot more now than they were in the 1970s. So what this tells us is, yes, mortality for women has been increasing, but so has been employment. So women have been taking up a lot of that extra health capacity that they've seen since the 1970s with extra work. Here's the males and females lined up against each other. Here we're doing hours, and we see similar kind of thing where the gap is fairly similar in terms of its shape. When we look at usual hours worked in the y-axis, which just tells you that a lot of this is on the extensive margin, not on the intensive margin, that most of this change is just people withdrawing from the labor force, not moving from full-time to part-time. When you work out the hours change versus the employment change, it looks like most of it is happening on the extensive margin and not the intensive margin. But things look about the same. Okay, so here what we're going to do is repeat that same exercise. Remember there we compared 1976 to 2012. What we're going to do here is compare every single year from 1976 to 2012 against 2012. So that data point right here where the hand is for males was 5 years. That said, that gap between 1976 line and 2012 line was 5 years. Let me just skip back a second here. So this gap here was 5 years. What we're going to do is, here we have the 2012 line, the red line. We're going to draw this again for every single year, for 77, for 78, for 79, all the way up to 2011. Now, not surprisingly, the 2011 line ends up being remarkably close to 2012 line. As you move from 76 to 2011, this gap gets closed. But interestingly, it's not closed at a uniform rate. It's not like it goes, halfway by 1995 and then halfway the rest of the time period. And that can be seen clearly in this graph right here, because what we see is between 1975 and 1995, that's when most of that gap is closed. So let me say explicitly what I mean. In 1995, the gap between that blue line and the red line in that employment-mortality relationship is already getting very close to the 2012 mark. In other words, that gap between the lines is only 1 year of potential work by 1995. What's going on here is that between 1975 and 1995, you have lifespans expanding at the same time as employment rates for older males are declining. So these things are going in the opposite direction. Lifespan improving, employment declining. So these things are working against each other, and that's why you have the 5 years of potential work in 1975 compared to 2012. Over the period from 1995 to 2012, we see very little change in this employment gap, and the reason for that is we saw employment rates coming back up for males, right? So let's just take a look at that. Here we see employment rates for males going up over this period at the same time as mortality rates have been improving. So what that means is over this period from 95 to 2012 or so, we've seen that, yes, mortality rates have been improving, lifespans have been expanding, but employment rates have more or less matched those increases, so that there has been an increase in work capacity, but employment rates have actually gone up to pretty much match that increase in work capacity. So that's for males. For females, what we see is, again, when we look at 1976 compared to 2012, there's a gap there, but by around the mid-1990s, from the, that gap has more capacity. So that's the way we would characterize this, is that most of that gap closed between 1976 and 1995. In that period since 1995, we have more or less seen the employment rates increase enough to take up that increase in health capacity. So that's what this slide says. There's been improvement in mortality rates, a large rise in work capacity. Since 1995, the employment rates have more or less taken that up. And from women, that's been true since about 1990. Okay, here's a fun part. You can redo this exercise. I'm going to skip back to the exercise again. Here's the graph where we look at males 76, males 2012, and graphed it out. Well, you can see you can take any base year in red and compare it to anything else you want in the blue. You can compare men versus women on the same graph. You can compare Ontario in 2012 in red versus the Prairie Province versus the Atlantic provinces in blue. You can take Ontario in 2012 in red and compare it to the United States in blue. And so you can do any kind of comparison like that, where the counterfactual is, you ask the question, what if people in the red line, males in 2012 in Canada, worked the same as your comparison group for each unit of mortality? How much more would those males in 2012 work if they worked like X comparison group that you have in mind? So here's what we do. We take, as our base, we average over the entire decade of the 2000s, and our base is males in Ontario in the 2000s. So the first one here is just calibrating the exercise to what we've seen so far, which is to say, let's look at males in Ontario in the 1970s. And we say, if males in Ontario in the 2000s worked the same per unit of health capacity as males in Ontario in the 2000s, they'd work about 5.8 years or something, about 5 and a bit years more work, which is similar to what we saw on the national scale from 2012 to 1976. So it's about the same there. Okay, let's look at other things here and see what we get. If males in the 2000s worked the same per unit of health capacity as females in 2000, they'd actually work about 5 years less, which just says that females are working a bit less than males per unit of health capacity. The next 4 bars in the graph look at across regions. And this is really actually pretty interesting because, let me just look at the Atlantic region as an example. If you look at males in Ontario in the 2000s, they worked between the ages of 55 and 69 on average 7.28 years. And that was actually 1.6 years more than those in Atlantic Canada. So people in Ontario at older ages worked more than those in Atlantic Canada. A natural question is Is that because of, you know, institutional rules like employment insurance or pensions or something like that? Is it because of tax systems, those higher tax rates in the Atlantic provinces versus the Ontario? Is it because of preferences? Or there's a different preference for retirement versus work in different provinces? Or is it because of health? Now, what we know is that mortality rates in the Atlantic provinces are higher than those in Ontario. So if we compare males in Ontario in the 2000s versus males in the Atlantic provinces in 2000s, where we see the difference in actual work is about 1.6 years over that time period, how much of that can be accounted for purely by this health capacity work as measured by mortality rates? And the answer is very little of it. It's about 0.7 years of work. In other words, if males in Ontario in 2000s work the same as males in Atlantic in the 2000s per unit of health, they work about 0.7 years less. But that's less than half of that 1.6 year gap. So in other words, or it's around half. So about half of that gap of the Atlantic versus Ontario male employment rates of older workers is accounted for by health differences. The other half is going to be accounted for by pensions, work opportunities, institutions, taxes, whatever your bag of tricks is, but about half of it is actually driven by health differences. So if you look at older workers and say, oh boy, those guys in the Atlantic provinces ought to be working as much as those guys in Ontario, you'd have to be forcing a lot of people who are unhealthy into the workforce in order to match them. So that's an important aspect of this here, that to expect the same employment rates in the Atlantic provinces as in Ontario, it'd be hard to do given prevalent health conditions. Okay, final thing to do is to look at the more refined and richer data that are available in the Canadian Community Health Survey, looking at waves from 2001 to the wave in 2014. Again, we can't look back to the 1970s here because we only have the health survey over this time period, but we do have much richer data. So there's a bit of a trade-off here. As I said, we view this as complementary to the other analysis. What we're going to do is estimate a relationship between employment and health indicators, where essentially this is going to be an explanatory model for employment, where employment is on the left-hand side and health indicators are going to be on the right-hand side. I'm going to calibrate that model based on a sample of 50 to 54-year-old men and women separately. And what we're going to do then is say, okay, here is a relationship between employment given your observed health conditions when you're age 50 to 54. Then we're going to take that estimated model and apply it to our 55 to 59-year-olds, our 60 to 64-year-olds, and our 65 to 69-year-olds. We're going to say, if you work conditional on your health conditions as much as those 50 to 54-year-olds, how much you're going to work. So in other words, we see that, you know, if you have bad self-assessed health, you're predicted to work less at age 50 to 54. Well, when we look at 65 to 69-year-olds, their self-assessed health is even worse. So we're going to account for how much worth your self-assessed health is and say, here's how much we expect you to work less because of that deterioration in your health across ages. And then we're going to say, how much did you actually work and measure against that? So we're going to have a predicted work measure based on this model that we calibrate to these younger 50 to 54-year-olds. We compare that to your actual work behavior and then look at that difference. Okay, so here it is, employed on the left-hand side, where we have three groups of explanatory variables on the right-hand side, where those three groups are health conditions. Number two is self-assessed health. Number three is various demographic characteristics that we observe in the data. We estimate this on our sample of 50 to 54-year-olds, and then we use that to predict employment for older workers and then compare that to actual employment. And here's what we get. Okay, when we look at 50 to 54-year-old males over here, we see that more or less by definition we have people who are employed, and we don't have any unused capacity here by definition because that's our reference group. When we take that model and apply it to 50 to 59-year-olds, we say, okay, we know that people who are 55 to 59 are a bit in worse health. That's going to mean that you're going to work a bit less. So we would predict, given your observed health, about 76% of them would be working. oh, sorry, we predict, excuse me, that 76 plus 0.09 is 85% of them will be working. We actually observed 76% of them to be working. So the total sum of these bars is how much we predict them to be working based on their observed health. And what we see here is in the salmon color, this is what we call the unused capacity. This is how much people actually do work. This is how much our health-based model suggests that they could work. When we look at the even older ages, we see that the salmon bars get even larger. I now notice getting close to lunchtime, and talking about salmon is making me hungry, so I will close up very shortly. We can see that for the older workers here, it gets very large. But this is, if you notice, a very gentle slope in the total amount of the bars, which is just suggesting that over these age ranges, the actual health deterioration is actually fairly slow. If you've looked a lot at the process of aging, you'll know that the health deterioration really kind of starts to gather speed in the ages of the 70s and the 80s, where that really starts to deteriorate. If we were to expand our model then, you start to see this drop off quite precipitously, because health conditions really tend to really pick up in the latter half of the 70s and into your 80s. But this is just what we say. We see employment drops off much more quickly than does employment capacity as measured by our model. Okay, so here, what are we doing? Men, women. Oh, here we're using, right. So here what we're doing in this graph over here is the same exercise with women as a reference group. So by definition, from age 50 to 54, there's no unused capacity because it's just the model we're estimating. And then we compare, whereas in the middle group here, we're using men as the reference group. And so there is some unused capacity here if men work the same as women, conditional on health. Okay, the last thing here is we do the same thing where we use Ontario men as a comparison group. So let me, do I have, oh, here's Atlantic right here. What we see is when we use Ontario men as a reference group, we find a fairly similar pattern. At age 50 to 54, there's not a huge increase in work if Atlantic men were to work as much as Ontario men. And again, importantly here, part of the reason why older workers in the Atlantic provinces don't work as much, and about, by our previous estimate, about half of it, is because their health is worse. And so to expect the same employment rates when their health is actually in worse shape would be to impose some extra hardship on those folks in Atlantic Canada. That's about what I'll say on that one. The key results here is that we view our results as indicating there is substantial health capacity to work among older men and women in Canada, that by our estimates, men age 55 to 69 could work 5 more years if they worked the same as men in 1970s per unit of health capacity. Using our CCHS-based estimates, men age 60 to 64 could work 29 percentage points more of them could work at age 60 to 64, and for women age 40 or in that age range, 43 percentage points more could work. So many caveats, and I'm sure this will feature largely in your questions, which we do look forward to. True ability to work is obviously unobservable. We are dealing with what's observable in the health data. The health measures that we have available may understate the severity of health conditions. There's certainly going to be a large degree to which they are unobservable. Estimates of capacity do depend on the reference group. You can see differences when we use different reference groups, which is important. And furthermore, estimates do not speak to opportunities for employment. They do not speak to heterogeneity across individuals, and specifically across SES groups. And specifically, we have nothing here to say about whether people should work more. This is not, we would not draw a policy conclusion here that people ought to work more. We're simply trying to point out that when we see these big increases in life expectancy that we have seen over the past 20 and 30 years, that there's a strong argument to make that some part of that could, with a C on front of it, could be taken up in extra work. Whether we choose as a society to take that up is a question for policy, question for politics, and ultimately a question for all of us to decide as citizens. Whether we should take that extra bounty of life expectancy that we've been given and how much we should split that into work, how much into retirement is a choice we should all face and should address with our policy and our political system and our economic choices. That's it for the presentation. I'll now turn it back to our host, Sarah Fortin, who will, I think, handle the question and answer session. Please, Sarah, the mic is back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin. There's a lot of information here, and it was very interesting, and I'm looking now if anyone has written a question. Yes, I have one here. I think I will, let me read it first. I think it's more of a comment, so I will read and we'll see at the end, okay?
Okay.
So first of all, thank you for a great webinar. I began looking at fertility rates as proxy for available pool of caregivers for elderly parents. I think fertility rates could provide a different angle for understanding employment rates in old age. For instance, adult children often act as a source of income for many. Statistics on fertility rates go back to 1926 in Canada, just a thought. So I guess.
So the question is about productivity rates, is that correct?
Pardon me?
The question is about productivity rates?
No, it's more like using fertility rates as a proxy.
Oh, fertility rates.
Fertility, yes.
Fertility rates. I'm going to rest my voice a bit and let Tammy come in. Tammy, would you like to answer that one? So the question is about fertility rates and the potential cross-generational impact of elderly and help in the home and questions like that.
So I'll start by making the blanket statement that this is clearly, taking a bit of a stretch away from what we're doing. This takes a different dimension on who is available for work. So what we've done is tried to capture what capacity people could be working in the paid labor market. When you're thinking about fertility and the role of individuals as becoming caregivers for elderly parents, you also have to think about what other alternatives there are to that paid labor market and whether there's something preventing them from getting in. So I think that's probably what this question is focused on. It's true, we couldn't get those fertility rates much further back. The difficulty there is then also trying to align that not only with the caregiving responsibilities, but trying to get measures of the labor market participation and what's being done, and bringing those together into the same package. And that's where we would have difficulty with that kind of analysis.
Thank you. Let me see if someone else, no one else came forward. Please, I invite you to use the question tab to write your question. So for now, maybe I can try one myself, if you will, Tammy and Kevin. And I was thinking maybe an implication of this, but if you will allow me to propose that, suppose that we take for granted that there's a health gap, and we could work longer and not thinking whether we should, but let's say we will, okay? And in terms of the policy implication and thinking in terms of the policy, the programs that are already in place on old age security versus Canada pension plan versus social assistance, for instance. I mean, if you change the age as was done under the Harper government, now back to 65, but suppose we would increase the age, should it be for the whole package or maybe only for old age security, because this is a basic and we expect people to work longer, and since CPP is a contributory program, maybe the implication is somewhat different, and possibly the implication for social assistance, of course, because if there's no old age anymore, of course the province will have possibly to step in. Anyway, your thought about this?
Yeah, Tammy, I'll take that one. Oh, you want to take it?
Both of you, maybe.
How about, well, both. I'll start, and Tammy can point out where I'm wrong. So my first answer to that is thinking about imagine we thought that there was capacity to work at older ages. the way I've always viewed this is kind of as the old doctor credo, which is first do no harm, which is to, rather than thinking about encouraging work with policy, first make sure that we are not discouraging work with policy. So that could be, there's a number of policy tools that might discourage work. There's rules about how pensions accrue and double dipping on pensions, for example. Tammy and I have a previous paper that looks at that. There's things like how the guaranteed income supplement interacts with the Canada pension plan and also with employment earnings. So now there's a window of $3,000 of employment earnings that is now exempt from GIS. That's one kind of policy tool you might look at. So those are some policy things. There's some pension policy in terms of private sector pension. There's also some public sector pension issues. But more broadly, thinking about workplace regulation and workplace environment, when you look at surveys of seniors of how they want to retire, how they want to work, there's a clear preference for smoothing things into part-time work and changing careers from a career job into something more part-time. To the extent we're able to facilitate that, those kind of preferences with policy, that we don't, penalize people by clawing back too much of their other pension in terms of tax policy or pension policy, but also making sure that on the employer side that, the way we deal with workplace regulation facilitates older work, facilitates part-time contracts, facilitates those kind of perhaps shorter and more variable work relationships is important. And I must point out that's a bit in contrast to the precarious work movement, or the anti-precarious work movement, where people say that things like contract work and part-time work are all characteristics of a bad job. They're also characteristics of a lot of jobs that people want, especially seniors who kind of want that kind of job. So that's the kind of thing I would pay attention to in terms of policy. Last point on policy, then I'll turn it over to Tammy. Thinking about specifically the old age security retirement age, I always thought about that move in both directions, not as, the only policy tool in the government's toolkit. It is one part of a big decision, and for a lot of Canadians, it's not actually the biggest part. We're talking for old age security is, $580 a month, which to many Canadians in the bottom part of the income distribution is critical to their well-being. But, to someone who's in the top part of the income distribution, it's not going to matter an awful lot. And so for some people, that's going to matter a lot. For others, it's not going to matter other ways. That's point one. Point two about that is things like the CPP actuarial adjustment rate that suggests how much extra kick you get, how much extra bonus you get to your CPP check if you delay retirement. That's another policy lever that I think has some potential to encourage or at least not discourage work at older ages. There are many policy tools the government has to affect that. And thinking about the old age security eligibility age is one part of it. As the questioner mentioned, that's a complicated nest. You have some people who are struggling, who are now at age 64 on provincial social assistance. If you move that age up to 67, that's 2 more years of social assistance that provincial governments are going to have to fund. And so when that movement was made in 2012, without any consultation with the provinces, I think it was a legitimate question for provinces to say, hey, you just stuck us with a big bill here, and maybe that wasn't the best thing to do, without thinking about how we integrate such a move with existing systems. And so perhaps compared to some, I'm a bit more open to questions of whether the old age security entitlement age is the best way to go. I know Tammy has some interesting thoughts on this, so this is where I'll push it right over to her on perhaps ways you can think about that entitlement age on OAS versus GIS. Tammy, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so clearly Kevin and I have probably been working together on these issues for about 15 years now, so you can imagine we agree on some things. I think the thing to emphasize here is that there's 2 groups that I would generally have in mind. There is, a group of individuals who have those gains in health and could be working, and I think the best role for policy there is to be neutral in incentives. Not creating incentives or disincentives to work, just offering the pension wealth that is there without any incentives to pick up at a particular time. That would be my ideal way of thinking about that. For those individuals with the health capacity to work, there's also a matter of setting up policies perhaps earlier in their careers so that you can better set up that second career, perhaps with upskilling and retraining. And there's opportunities for those kinds of labor market policies earlier in individuals' careers. So that's the one group. On the other side of that, of course, is that group of individuals who are in the lowest part of that health distribution. They have the much worse health. They aren't able to simply continue working if you were to increase eligibility ages. And so one thing that I've suggested there is the simplest way to think about it is to separate things like the guaranteed income supplement from OAS eligibility and think of those as two separate programs. You can keep a guaranteed income supplement eligibility at an earlier age than say your old age security type of demo grant, and think of those as two separate programs.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I don't think there were anyone ask a question, so I guess they had the opportunity to do it if they wish. So it's 3 o'clock. Kevin is hungry, so I guess I will just thank you for now, and very, very interesting. I appreciate very much the time you've taken, and I want to say again that the video and the PowerPoints will be available after the webinars within give us a few days. I'd like also to mention that our next webinar is on March 1, and it's not exactly, but again, about employment and labor markets. So we will discuss with Guy Lacroix, Quebec's parental leave program, the impact. And the program is now 10 years old, I believe. So we'll discuss this. Again, thank you very much, Tammy and Kevin, and everyone who's been joining us. I look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thank you very much for your questions and your attention.